Some Canadian scientists are calling it a war on knowledge. Over the past few years, the federal government has been cutting funding to hundreds of renowned research institutes and programs. More than 2,000 jobs have been lost. Tonight on the Fifth Estate, Lyndon McIntyre speaks with some of those scientists. We'll hear what they weren't allowed to talk about and what's at stake for Canadians. Here's a preview of tonight's program, Silence of the Labs.
Looks like it's been worse along here and here.
She was digging up 1,000 years of history, but it took just minutes to bury her career.
She said, you have 5 minutes to collect important personal things, and I said, everything here is important to me. This is my life.
He was dedicated to reversing the destruction of our oceans.
You could hear a pin drop. People were ashen. We all knew what was happening.
Scientists and science decimated by a transformation in political priorities.
It crippled my life's work.
Obliterating years of talent and experience.
My entire research group disappeared. They deserved a better fate than this. And for that reason, they won't come back.
You can't argue against prosperity. You can't argue against more jobs and a prosperous North.
Right. You certainly can't. But you can question the claim that the policy direction they're following is going to result in more jobs and more prosperity. The attempt to sell the Keystone Pipeline in the United States is in terms of jobs. President Obama commented the other day, well, it's going to create for a year or so 2,000 construction jobs and then a handful of maintenance jobs. There aren't an appreciable number of jobs that are going to come out of that. The notion that the way Canada is going to advance is by a zealous increase in our export of oil and natural gas, and that we have to ease up the restrictions to allow more of that, flies in the face of all of the research on climate change. And if that research is correct, and about 98% of the scientists who do research on climate change agree, we're going to be in real trouble with the increased temperatures, with the changed climate, the costs of the natural disasters that we're seeing increasingly, the extreme weather, is going to make the gains we get from more energy pale in comparison to the costs of coping with the floods and the natural disasters that follow from the change in climate, such that crops you can't grow, the spread of insects into areas that are destroying forests and other kinds of things that are an offshoot of climate change. You know, the climate scientists are really clear the direction we're going is going to be a disaster economically. So to say, well, we're going to ignore all that science because we want to create jobs and exporting more oil and extracting more natural gas is going to pay off is just, again, ideology or blinders, rather than saying, let's try to set our policy by looking at what we know. Let's start with knowledge. Let's plan for Canadians based on the most expert knowledge we can have. Everybody's in favor of jobs. The only question is, how do we get there?
Actually been told, you owe your loyalty to the government.
Absolutely.
As opposed to the public.
That's right, and that's absolutely wrong. Scientists and people working in the public sector owe their loyalty to the public. That's the heart of it, and that's what this government doesn't understand, in fact feels threatening. If I could just read you one little quote, that's, just as we have one department, we should have one voice. Interviews sometimes present surprises to ministers and senior management. Media relations will work with staff on how best to deal with a request for an interview. This should include asking the program expert, that is a scientist, to respond with approved lines. So it's like scientists read from the briefing notes that the politicians give them, or the bureaucrats give them. I mean, that's just unacceptable and undermines the work of scientists and undermines the respect for scientists, and ultimately means a lot of people aren't going to take jobs in Canada if that's the kind of restrictions they're put on. It makes sense to people to say, well, if we're putting public money into something, we should put it into that research or those projects that are going to pay off. That makes sort of common sense to anyone. The problem is it doesn't work. Mr. Harper would probably be the first one to say politicians shouldn't be trying to pick winners and losers in the business world. We leave that to business people, right? And yet they think they can pick winners and losers in the scientific and academic world when politicians can't. Our ability to predict whose research is going to lead to earth-shattering discoveries is abysmal. Over the years, over 100 years, we've discovered the best thing we can do to maximize the possibility of spending our money well is to have people develop their proposals, have those reviewed by experts in their fields through a process we call peer review, and then to fund the best scientists and let them go ahead. And out of that, good things will come. Also out of that, a lot of dead ends will come, but we learn from it. And if you think if the public thinks of things that they take for granted, none of them came out of somebody setting out to do it. So they all came out of basic research, whether it be lasers or radios or GPSs or MRIs or X-rays or computers. I mean, all those kinds of things. I could go on for longer than this program with illustrations. If you talk to any biologist or chemist or physicist and say, what are the most important discoveries in your field over the last 100 years? What are the most important things that have come out of your field? They've all come as a result of basic research. So it's harder to explain how letting a scientist pursue what they think, a good scientist, continue to explore and research what they think is important, is in fact the most practical thing you can do. So I think that's why there hasn't been as much take-up, because the notion of, well, we're going to fund what's practical and the companies, we should do what they want, but that's not how we move forward. We'd still, if that were the approach, we'd still be in horses and buggies, I'm afraid.
You say you're sitting home with your cup of tea, watching all these scientists in their lab coats ranting in the streets. Are you saying, oh, get over it, you're not muzzled, or are you saying, this is a good thing?
I think in a way I have some sympathy, because I work with many of the public sector scientists who feel disenfranchised from the public debate. But having been an expert and a professional in executive government, I recognize that they've had a relatively privileged position over the last number of decades, in that they've been given liberty to speak on issues that are of public import, because they were perceived as not having a policy role. You go down the list of issues that where people think they're muzzled or are saying they're muzzled. There are areas that are quite controversial and are part of the public dialogue. Regulation of health technologies and products, role of GMOs in the agri-food system, climate change, resource development in at-risk environments. Each of those we have, the evidence is contributing. Each person's individual piece of research will contribute a small piece of evidence to that needs to be part of the decision making. But no piece is definitive.
But as a citizen, I want to hear it all. Yep. And I want to hear them. And I don't want Joe Oliver or Stephen Harper saying, well, you're going to hear this bit, but you're not going to hear that bit.
And maybe this is an argument for reducing the amount of basic research that goes on in intramural programs within executive government or the special operating agencies. And in a way, I think that's part of what we've seen in the last couple of years, as the federal government has moved some of that research into university settings, some of it into special institutes that are arm's length and give people the liberty to engage in public dialogue. I think it's part of what's going on at the National Research Council, where there have been a lot of scientists who've been doing some very good basic research. And it's basic research that is not currently being done or hasn't historically been done in public universities. But there's not much difference between what they were doing and what an academic would do, except it might be more applied and directed towards government interests, government problems that are there. So I think part of what you're seeing at NRC is a shift. If that kind of science is no longer being valued by the state, perhaps it does make some sense to move some of their resources away from basic discovery science into more commercial science that has more commercial application rather than policy application.
And to leave pure science more to the academics?
Well, there are ways of incentivizing academics to do all of that work. It may not be the most efficient, effective ways, but there are a lot of scientists in public universities and public institutions or private research institutions who could do that work. So I think this isn't a black or white problem. It's shades of gray. And when it's shades of gray, it's hard to say one side's all right and one side's all wrong. They both got aspects of being right and wrong in their arguments.